All right. Welcome back to Coffee with Scott. Grab your coffee, grab your Bible, your pen, grab your notebook, pull out a chair, push up to the table, and let's dig into part 3 of our Gospel of Matthew through first century Hebraic eyes. Now, most people think the idea of a suffering Messiah started after Jesus died, that Christians invented it to explain the cross. But what if I told you that before Jesus was ever born, that there were writings found that were already talking about a rejected righteous one, an afflicted priestly redeemer, an ancient, not an ancient, but even atonement connected to a person. So today we're going to dig deep. We're going to connect Isaiah 53. We're going to be connecting some things found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to be looking at some things. We're going to be connecting things in the Gospel of Matthew. And Jesus as the Melchizedek high priest. Because once you see this, the Matthew's Gospel will never read the same again. Now, most modern readers assume that the people before and during the time of Jesus were expecting a conquering king Messiah, a political deliverer, a son of David type figure who would defeat Rome. And that expectation did exist, but it wasn't the only one. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they revealed something shocking. That some people in the time of Jesus were also expecting a suffering. The Dead Sea Scrolls is going to put it a suffering righteous one. They were expecting a priestly Messiah, a Melchizedek type redeemer. Some were even expecting two Messiahs. Now this matters because this is the world that Matthew is writing to. This is the world that Matthew is writing in. And I say that because there's something that people sometimes forget. And that is that this Bible, this book, was not written during our time. It was not written to, we're here in the United States, so it's not centered in the United States. So we have to keep in mind as we look at these things, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint that we read from time to time, and different things that, and especially with Matthew, the Gospels, let me say the Gospels, they're writing to a world that is, as we've already said, is expecting or has different messianic expectations. So the idea of a suffering Messiah, a suffering Redeemer, begins with Isaiah 53. So let's go to Isaiah 53 and look at a couple of verses. I'm going to be reading from the New King James today. So in Isaiah 53 in verse 3, It says he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. So right off the start here in Isaiah in 53, we're not seeing a conquering king. So, but let me back up for just a minute before we go any further with Isaiah 53. I believe I said this in our first part of the Gospel of Matthew series that we're doing, is that Isaiah 53, at this time in Judaism, Isaiah 53 is referring to Messiah. In modern Judaism, they were going to say that Isaiah 53 is referring to Israel. As we go through this Gospel of Matthew and these Isaiah 53 and some other resources, we're going to see that the Isaiah 53 is referring, it is a Messianic chapter, expectation, Messianic chapter, Messianic expectation. So now let's get back to where we were headed. So Isaiah, the first verse 3 says, he is despised and rejected by men. He's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So we see here not a conquering king, but a rejected sufferer. If we go on down, let's go to verse 5. Verse 5 says, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. And by his stripes we are healed. So his suffering is not random, it is atoning. We see this in verse 5 of Isaiah 53. Now let's look at verses 10 and 11. And it says, part of 10, the part we want to focus on, says, you make his soul an offering for sin. And then down at verse 11, part of that says, my righteous servant shall justify many. For he will, or the King James says, for he shall bear their iniquities. Notice the language here. Guilt offering, bearing sin, justifying many. This is priestly language. So Isaiah gives us a mystery, so to speak, because he's talking about a suffering servant, one who brings atonement like a priest, yet clearly messianic. So the question becomes, did anyone actually expect this? Expect this type of Messiah? The answer to that question is yes. There were people, as we've already said, some were expecting a son of David type character, others expecting a suffering servant type of a Messiah. And so we're going to look at how Jesus fulfills this expectation. And we're going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So as we do this, keep in mind that the Dead Sea Scrolls date from about 200 before Common Era through 70 Common Era. So 200 BC to 70 AD, and many of these were written before Jesus lived. So they show us what some people believe and expected in the first century. What do we find in them? We find language of righteous suffering, rejected leader, priestly redeemer, atonement through a person. This means that the New Testament didn't invent these ideas. Jesus stepped into the expectations already alive. So let me just explain that. So these ideas, as we said in the beginning, there are some that will say that these ideas, these messianic expectations, were created by the church after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But our scriptures that we have before his arrival and sources as these ancient Dead Sea Scrolls are going to support that these predate. One of them we're going to look at, I believe, if I just recall correctly, I believe this is also mentioned in a previous video where we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls just a couple of weeks ago. But I believe that one of them we're going to look at today predates Jesus, I'm going to say, by at least, I'm going to say 200 years. So it's going to predate him by 200 years. He shows up. So it's clearly not an expectation that was invented by early believers. It was already existed. And I'm going to say it like this way: Jesus stepped into it. It was already there, already an expectation, and he steps into that expectation. So there is one scroll. It's called 4Q 541. It describes a coming priestly figure. And I want you to listen carefully to what is said when it's talking about this coming priestly character. It says, "They will speak many words against me, and they will devise evil schemes against me." Now, does that sound familiar? Because that is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But if you go back and you look at Isaiah 53, we see that Isaiah says that he will be despised and rejected. Now, let's go to Matthew chapter 26, 26. And let's go down to verse number 3. We're going to look at verses 3 and 4. And it says, "Then the chief priest, the scribes, and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him." So the parallels between what Matthew wrote and what the Dead Sea Scrolls say about this, for them, a future coming priestly figure. Dead Sea Scrolls say they will speak many words against him and they will devise evil schemes against him. What does Matthew say? He says that the priests and elders plotted to arrest Jesus and to kill him. So the parallels are they spoke against him, they plotted against him, and he is a rejected leader. But this figure in this 4Q 541 is not just suffering. He is connected to teaching righteousness and removing guilt and bringing purification. That is priestly work. So before Jesus, I'm going to continue to say this as we go through this. Some were expecting, we'll just say it this way: Son of David, kingly conqueror, deliverer. And some were expecting a suffering priest Redeemer. So we're not going to look at this tonight, but just let me give you an example. Okay, so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, then let me slow down. So we had said earlier that some expected two messiahs. Now, I don't believe that there were two individual messiahs. There were Messianic titles that were assigned to Messiah. So even in Matthew, you have son of David, son of Abraham. In the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, you read of son of man. That's a Messianic title. We read son of God in the New Testament. That is a Messianic title, and at some point we'll discuss those two titles together of Son of God and Son of Man, because I don't think in our mind, they don't think they are not. Let me say that they're not what you think they are. Okay? They are Messianic titles, but they don't mean what you may think they mean. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, moving on from that, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are also Messianic titles given to this future coming Messiah. Two of those that we'll discuss also at some point, we won't dig into them now, but is Messiah of Israel and Messiah of Aaron. You also don't read it in the Dead Sea Scrolls that I've seen so far, but in Judaism, when they feel there are two messiahs, they have Messiah, son of Joseph, and Messiah, son of David. So this is where I think they get the idea of two messiahs, but we know that Jesus fulfills both of those roles. And we're going to see that as we go on here a little bit. But back to our study here. So, as we just said, so before Jesus, some were expecting a suffering priestly redeemer. Now, there is another scroll called the Thanksgiving Hymns. It says, this is what it says about this figure. It says, "They have driven my life into the pit. I am a man of strife and contention." So once again, we see righteous sufferer language. Another line in that scroll says, "Through me you have illuminated the face of many." See, his suffering benefits many. Light comes through his afflictions. Or you can say that sounds like Isaiah. Isaiah says, "My righteous servant shall justify many." So the category already existed. So let's go now to this Melchizedek and look at Melchizedek in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we're going to go just a little deeper. So a scroll called 11Q13 describes Melchizedek as an end-time redeemer. Now, listen to what some of the things it says about Melchizedek. It says, "He will proclaim liberty to the captives, and he alone, he will atone for all the sons of light." Now, I want to stop here at this sons of light. And I did not mark it to actually go back and look at it in the scripture. Sons of light may to some be a strange phrase or a strange term, because I don't think that it's really brought out much in modern Christianity. So you may throw your hands in the air and say, "Oh my word, we're looking at this Dead Sea Scrolls and they're talking about sons of light. That's not scriptural." It is scriptural. Jesus references sons of light in the Gospels. And this phrase, sons of light, may be in the Gospels 2 or 3 times. So it is a scriptural, biblical phrase. So don't think we're going off out into left field anywhere. But it says, let me start again. So it says, he will proclaim liberty to the captives, and he will atone for all the sons of light. Melchizedek, this is who they're talking about. This figure, the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to describe him as a heavenly priestly figure. But he proclaims freedom, he brings redemption, and he makes atonement. So, as I just said, they look at him as a heavenly high priest redeemer. So in the time of Jesus, there was expectation of a Melchizedek type deliverer who brings the final atonement. So now if we go to Matthew, and we've just mentioned this, but I want to mention it again. If we go to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, we read, let me turn there so we can just read it from, if I can turn there. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. The book of the genealogy, I think in our first part of our Gospel of Matthew series, we pointed out this word genealogy. In the Greek is the word Genesis. We pointed out that all 4 Gospels point you right back to the beginning. So Matthew says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. So what do we have in those 2 titles alone? We have Messiah, we have King, we have promise. But now what Matthew does is Matthew quickly shows that the Messiah, Jesus, will suffer. Let's go to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 17. And he says, well, let's see, do we want to start here? Let's start at verse 16. How about that? And it says, when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word, and healed all who were sick. Verse 17 starts with, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, he himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. That is, as we've just seen, a direct reference to Isaiah 53. So Matthew is saying that Jesus is the suffering servant. Let me say that again. Matthew is saying that Jesus is that suffering servant in Isaiah 53. So we see that he's suffering. Isaiah says that he is going to be rejected. Let's go to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12 and verse 14. I tell you what, let's start at verse 11. Then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out. Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. So this is exactly what the Dead Sea Scrolls text said. They would plot against the righteous one. They would plot against the righteous one. Let's go a little further. Let's go to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 28. Let's go to verse 27. And he says, then he took the cup. This is that last supper that Jesus is going to have with the disciples. And it says, then he took the cup and gave thanks and gave to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for remission of sins. So once again, we see an echo of Isaiah 53. He bore the sins of many. Once again, priestly, atoning, messianic. And then Matthew is also going to do something. He's going to hint at Psalm 110. In Matthew 22, Jesus quotes, the Lord said to my Lord. Psalm 110 also says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Then Hebrews 5 and 6. Hebrews 5 and 6 also says, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews 9 and 12 says, he entered once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. So just in these scriptures that you have Matthew pointing back to, you have the writer of Hebrews pointing back to, they show Jesus as the high priest, the atoning sacrifice, the Melchizedek priest, the suffering redeemer. He fulfills Isaiah. He fulfills the Dead Sea Scroll expectations. And Matthew paints a portrait. He paints a picture showing that where Jesus fulfills all these expectations. So, as we've said, his first coming, people were expecting the conqueror, the King David type, overthrow the Roman government. Let's establish the kingdom. Let's get this thing rolling. But he didn't come as the King David type, the conqueror type. Jesus came the first time. Let's go to Luke 4 real quick. This is really off of track. But let's look. Because we have, and we'll look at it now, but we have a teaching coming up where we will look at this again. So in Luke 4, just rather quickly, little deer path we're going to head down. In the beginning of Luke 4, we see that Jesus is going through the wilderness temptation. He comes through that. And then in verse 14, it says, Then Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news of him went out through all the surrounding region, and he taught in their synagogues, being glorified by all. So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. Now I want you to know that the person that handed the scroll of Isaiah to Jesus didn't pick the place for him to read. Jesus picked the place. There was not a pre-selected place. Let me say it that way. So just a little before, I'm getting ahead of myself, but okay. So the portion that Jesus is going to read tells us several things. What time of the year it was. It's a feast day, but it's also a Jubilee year. These are two things I want you to remember. Write those things down because, like I said, in a soon coming teaching, probably next week, we're going to be looking back at this again. So this is what he reads. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And he stops there. There is more to that, but he stops there. I believe the next phrase will be about the vengeance of the Lord. But I want you to know that he does not read that part that day. He stops right there because when he's here at that time, it's not about the conquering king type figure. That's not what it's about. It's about the one that's come to make atonement. Let's say it that way. And so I just want you to keep in mind as we move on that it's atonement when he reads this. It's the year of Jubilee that he reads this. It's not by accident that this is when he is reading that. And I want to go further in this, but if I do, we're going to go long and there won't be a reason to teach this next week. So let's get back on our subject at hand. The unexpected but expected Messiah. Okay, so here's the takeaway. The idea of a suffering, atoning Messiah was not invented later. We have established that. There would be some that would say it's a later first believer Christian thing that was made up to explain why he was crucified, why he was beaten. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that before Jesus, some were already expecting a righteous sufferer, a rejected leader. Most importantly, if we took this book, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we laid it aside and never picked it up again, if we had this book, we would still know that people were expecting a suffering, righteous sufferer, a rejected leader. They were expecting a priestly redeemer. They were expecting a Melchizedek, deliverer. They were expecting that thing. And then Jesus comes. He suffers. He's rejected. He brings atonement. He becomes our high priest. So he doesn't create a new story. He fulfills the one already unfolding. So I want you to understand, if you're reading Matthew without, and I hope you're gaining this part, if you're reading Matthew without a first century context, a first century understanding, then you're only seeing part of the picture. But when you read it with that understanding, it kind of, you get a more broad picture. It's almost like today a person could zoom in, and this may not be a good example, but say we zoom in on this part like that maybe, then you would never know until you back up and you get a broader image that, and this is a poor example, that it's a coffee cup. So, and we understand too that, how do we say this? Because I don't want you to think that I'm off my rails, but Jesus didn't come, okay, let's say it this way. The first words out of Jesus' mouth were not, "I'm the Messiah." Not the first words out of his mouth. He fulfills the expectations that some people didn't even realize existed. Okay? So we're going to end with that. As I said, we're going to look at another avenue next week in our teaching for next week. But I will just ask you that if you found this video to be helpful, it helps me and it helps the YouTube algorithm. If you comment, make a comment about the teaching. It helps if you like the video. It just helps push it out more. So I will tell you that I'm doing this because I love the Word. If you know me, you know I love this book. I love the Word. I love to teach this Word. And there's more coming. We're just getting started. We're just digging down deep. So let me say it this way. Thank you for spending your time with me at Coffee with Scott. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you have enjoyed this. I hope you have learned something that you did not know. Like, share, comment the video, and we'll see you next time. Coffee with Scott at Covenant Cafe.